Hey guys, welcome to another lesson video. Today we're going to continue our study of the Middle Ages by talking about feudalism, the social structure or social hierarchy of medieval Europe. Let's get started. So, if we backtrack from where we ended yesterday, we know that William the Conqueror was able to invade England and become king, and when he does that, he totally reorganizes England. We know that he takes all the land away from individual landowners and redistributes it. So it doesn't matter if your family owned the same farm for 300 years, it was now gone. It didn't belong to you anymore. In fact, as we can recap from yesterday, William keeps 20% of the land for himself. He gives 25% to the church, probably as a thank you for the support that he received from them of his invasion. And then he divides up the rest of the land among all the Norman barons who helped him defeat Harold. Now, this redistribution of land is going to create a new system of relationships between the people that own land and the people that did not own land, and this is called feudalism. So, let's talk about how this system works. First of all, feudalism is a social structure. It is how society will be organized during the High Middle Ages. Now, remember, it's going to be based on land ownership, but it's also based on military service. So essentially what happens is the leader, a king, or whoever owns the land, and then in exchange for military service and loyalty to that leader, between kings, lords, and knights, there's an exchange of land that's going to happen. Now, manorialism is an economic system that's mainly between the lords and the peasants. Lords are going to be those who own the land because the king or the leader gave them land to have. So this is sort of the next rung on the ladder or the next step down the pyramid. And peasants are going to be the largest group during the Middle Ages. They're going to be the workers, and they are not going to own land. Now, a manor is a large house where the lord lived. In exchange for protection and a small part of land that would probably be like the size of a garden, peasants are going to work the lord's land to produce crops and goods for the manor. And in exchange, they're going to be able to live, hopefully, in peace. Now, this is a pretty good illustration of what this would look like. The lord would live in this manor house, most likely made out of stone. This might look more like a castle or a fortress, or it might be more like what we would consider a mansion. Most likely, there would be a village church, and this would also have belonged to the Lord, but he would want a church on his land. Then we're going to have small plots where peasants are going to be able to live and have a home and have a garden or a place to raise some animals. But there's going to be larger fields, as you can see, where the Lord is going to have the peasants work the land to harvest crops for the manor. We're also over here having a mill, and that's what would ground up the wheat to make flour so that people could have bread. Here's a blacksmith over here. We're going to have grazing animals. And basically all of this is a self-sufficient farm where everyone hopefully has what they need. If this lord is a good person, generally speaking, he's going to make sure his peasants are taken care of, even though they work really hard. And in this case, this is a very nice lord because these are extremely nice houses. I would say a lot of peasants' homes did not look nearly this nice and were probably more like what we would consider small shacks. So, these systems provided people with protection and safety by establishing a stable society where people were protected, things were consistent, everyone knows their role. However, it's extremely, extremely important to know that not everyone had equal rights or opportunities. A lot of social groups are going to be left out of making big decisions and making, kind of individual choices in some point. All right, so let's get into a little bit more what this looks like. We can look at feudalism as a social pyramid with the king at the top and also the church. They're going to sort of share the role as most powerful. Then we have the nobles and lords and lesser lords. These are going to be the individuals who are going to be loyal and pay taxes to the king and provide military. And so in exchange, the king is going to grant them land. Then the lords and nobles, pardon me, are going to need soldiers to help support the king and help to protect their land. So they're going to have knights who they're going to give part of their land to in exchange for protection and their military service. And then we're going to have peasants, of course, who are going to also be the workers. And they're not going to own land, but they may have a small plot to be able to farm for themselves. We'll get into this final group, serfs, here in just a moment. Here's a little bit more of a complex pyramid, and there's relationships between these two groups, there's relationships between these two groups, there's relationships between these two groups, and then all of them as well. So this is sort of a give and take situation. Now let's talk about how this actually worked. So we're going to use Spencer County as an example. So the king, also known as a monarch, is going to own all of the land in the kingdom, but the church, remember, also owns large amounts of land as well. So let's pretend that Spencer County is the kingdom and the king owns all of Spencer County. Now the church also owns a chunk of land, so let's give the church Taylorsville Lake over here. All right, so that's the church's land. Then lords would be given some land by the king. So for example, a lord may get the land that makes up just Taylorsville, downtown Taylorsville, okay? So then all this other land would have also been divvied up among other lords. All right. So as we're continuing on, we know that the king keeps this land for himself, but gives fiefs or grants of land to the most important lords who become known as vassals. Okay, I'm going to go back for a second and then I'll come back. So this plot of land is a fief. It is given to a lord who is a vassal to the king. A vassal is anyone who owes anything to someone higher than them in the pyramid. Basically, a vassal has someone who is sort of ahead of them or in charge of them, and they are the person that serves them. Okay? Now, in return for a fief of land, the Lord is promising to supply the king with knights in the times of war. And so then the Lord has to grant parts of their land, smaller fiefs, to the lesser lords and knights to make them vassals to him. So again, it's just constantly building up this pyramid. Now, the land-owning lord is the one that has total control of every person that lives on their land. They're even the judge. They decide court cases. They can give punishments. They're the total authority on that piece of land unless the king comes to visit. All right. Now, at the very bottom of this social system are the peasants. And again, their whole purpose is they're giving up personal freedom to work on the Lord's land in exchange for protection from early on Vikings and then later from war or battle or any kind of situation that could arise. And they do have a small plot of land generally to farm on, and this system is known as manorialism. Now, peasants had to pay taxes to the Lord. They may have to give money, they may have to give time in the form of their labor. They might even have to give part of the harvest of their small garden that they have. But peasants have very few rights. They even have to ask for permission from the Lord to even be able to leave the manor, to leave that land. But the group that had the fewest opportunities are called serfs. They're a type of peasant who is basically tied, quote unquote, to the land they worked. Essentially, this is slave labor. They had no freedom. They had no choices. They are going to be the lowest of the low. So serfs are, again, comparable to like slave labor. And it was a very harsh way to live. Okay? Now, as you can see from this painting from the time period, you have an overseer. You have people working extremely hard. They're also doing pretty dangerous work. This was not an easy life, to say the least, but people were willing to give up some of their choices and freedoms in exchange for the protection of the lords and the knights. So something to keep in mind. All right, we're going to watch a little video to help us better understand what this system was like. So let's take a look.
Feudalism is a term that came into use in the 19th century to describe how society was structured during the High Middle Ages, that's between 1000 and 1300 AD. Earlier historians modelled a feudal system based on the exchange of land and services. Under this feudal system, most land in the kingdom belonged to the king, and some to the church. The king parcelled out large estates to great lords known as tenants-in-chief, in exchange for their military and political support. These great lords then parcelled out smaller portions of land to lesser lords on similar terms, who did the same to local lords, who did the same to peasants. The system is often represented as a pyramid with the king at the top. The feudal system had its own vocabulary. A king or lord who gave land to a lesser lord became the latter's overlord. The person receiving the land became the vassal of the person who granted it, and the land itself was called a fief. These relationships could even cross national borders. After the Norman conquest, it was not uncommon for lords to hold lands in England and France, owing allegiance to both kings. Even the King of England was a vassal of the King of France for the territories he had inherited there. Although this model reflects some fundamental truths about how medieval political culture worked, historians now think it is too simplistic to explain what was really going on. For one thing, the pyramid implies that all ties of loyalty were vertical, and that everyone was dependent on someone higher up in the pyramid. In fact, this wasn't always the case. Many feudal relationships were horizontal, among equals. For another, the kinds of services given in return for land could be very varied. For peasants, this was labour service or rent, while for landowners, it was more like an alliance. Vassals were expected to support their overlords politically and militarily. By the later Middle Ages, though, feudalism had largely disappeared from Europe. This was the result of a number of factors. Firstly, medieval kings grew less reliant on their great lords to provide soldiers for their armies, turning instead to professional paid soldiers. This process had already started in the 12th century, and by around 1300, kings no longer expected to assemble armies based on obligations to provide military service. This weakened the bonds of feudal political culture. Secondly, the Black Death, which arrived in England in 1348, significantly reduced the population available to work the land. Those who were lucky enough to survive the epidemic had increased bargaining power and could increasingly choose where they worked and demand higher wages. This meant that the nobility gradually lost their control over the lower and middling ranks in society. Finally, the growing economic importance of towns, which typically sat outside the feudal system with their own charters, and trade, also contributed to the decline of feudalism, gradually reducing the power of the nobility and leading to the growth of prosperous middling urban classes. So, to recap, the great lords were less frequently expected to provide military service to the king, the peasants were increasingly able to live and work where they wanted, and money replaced manpower as the key agent of economic and political power. Whilst feudalism declined in England from the 14th century onwards, it was not formally abolished until the 10 Years' Abolition Act of 1660. In other European countries, the end of feudalism came much later. France abolished feudalism after the 1789 revolution, and Russian peasants had to wait until 1861 to be made free. Amazingly, the last remaining traces of feudalism in the British Isles made it into the 21st century, until finally abolished by the Scottish Parliament in June 2000, with the Abolition of Feudal Tenure Act, which took effect in November 2004.
So as you can see, this system can be quite complex, but just keep in mind it was the way that society was organized. It was a system of relationships between all of these groups, and that some people gave up their own personal freedoms to be safe and to have someone who sort of could help them in times of trouble. So keep all of this in mind.